In the newspapers this morning, there is a suggestion coming from UEFA that one possible way out in the short term for the FAI from the financial quagmire they find themselves in would be to sell their share of the Aviva. Dan McDonnell had this story in the Irish Independent this morning. Dan, good morning to you.
Morning, Ger.
There's only one potential buyer, is there? Or is this the type of thing that you could sell to an IMG or one of those companies who then would try and maximise their revenue from it?
Yeah, now you would think there would only be one real potential buyer. I can't imagine how the other scenarios would play itself out. I mean, I guess this is a view that does exist. Amongst certain people in UEFA who are obviously briefed and aware of the FAI figures. I mean, they obviously are probably looking at things in a cold and unemotional way, and they just look at a financial situation and they look at what your assets might be, and they think that this is something that should be considered, whether it really flies or could be contemplated by the FAI. I mean, I think they're aware of it, but I mean, that's another matter. But I suppose it exposes how serious the financial situation must be, that something like this, that there's an external view that this should be countenanced. But to go back to your original point, I mean, just with the whole situation of the stadium, the fact that it's a lease, that it's going back to the IRFU eventually, some way into the future, it will be the IRFU aspect that you will be looking at that if this was to be explored in any way.
How is this proposal actually delivered to the FAI? What stage of conversations are we at where an organisation who you owe a lot of money to comes in, looks at your books and goes, "Whew, you need to flip this"?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's known and it's been written that UEFA have been, I suppose, holding the FAI's hand throughout this entire, this entire process. I mean, going as far back as the summer, they've been going through the books. They've been engaged in terms of a review, in terms of a business plan. I think it's been, reported in our paper today that there's 15 million of advance funds being laid aside to get the FAI through the initial crisis. But the initial crisis is just that. I mean, if you're drawing down funds, from monies that are owed to you in the coming years, then naturally when the coming years come around, then you have to maybe look to draw down from the future years, unless you've somehow managed to looked at something dramatic to address your sort of cash flow position and to give you some kind of certainty. And this is why, I mean, options and suggestions are raised, that they're floated. It may not be a case that they put things on paper and say this is a firm proposal. This is just discussion, but this is a view that is held in certain quarters. And again, my impression on it would be that I'm not sure that this is something that the FAI are going to look at other options. They're going to look at every option right now. But I mean, we don't have any evidence from looking and reporting and studying the FAI picture that that the figures presented later this week are going to be good. They're going to reveal a substantial debt, and there is no easy way to cure that debt position unless they're suddenly going to happen upon substantial amounts of money. And I'm sure you can qualify for tournaments again and again, but that can only generate so much either, because tournament revenues can be chipped away at. So you have to look at your options, and this is one that an outsider thinks should be looked at.
What would the feeling within the FAI be, just even kind of by your own guesswork, if they were to get back into a situation where they had to rent the Aviva Stadium or Lansdowne Road as it used to be from the IRFU? I presume this is not something that is very palatable to the FAI at the moment. No,
and I can't imagine. It's. I suppose the only thing you have to say is who is the FAI at the moment. I mean, the FAI are having, are facing a sort of a massive leadership issue, has been well reported yesterday. John Foley has stepped aside. We know that perhaps the people that are driving decision-making in the FAI now may not be there in 12 months' time. I mean, there's 4 new independent directors due to come in, an independent chair is due to come in. Some new board members have come in, but others will be replaced next June. So, the the hierarchy of the FAI. There's going to be a new chief executive appointed at some shape, some way down the road. So, I mean, 12 months' time, you're going to have probably a different FAI leadership to now. What doesn't change, I guess, is the FAI membership. I mean, there is moves to change and sort of reshuffle and sort of refresh some of the bodies that sit on council. But, I mean, there are people up and down the country who, over a long period of time, have been engaged in the, I guess, process of trying to sell tickets for the Aviva for taking some pain because the cost of delivering the stadium was worth it. So you would think it would be pretty unpalatable to suddenly have to contemplate acknowledging that was almost, I don't know if waste of time is the right phrase, but I mean, it would be quite a retrograde step. So I think that's why it would be a pretty hard one to push through. But the broader point is that if the opinion exists that it should be considered, this is why, well, then you have to look at serious alternatives as well. And that in every scenario you look at here, there's going to have to be some pain encountered, and it's a case of where you can take it.
Like, what about the eventual route of disbanding the FAI and starting from scratch? It's something that Eamon Dunphy is floating in the Star this morning. It's radical, but we've seen it happen in other Irish institutions before. Is this something that perhaps people within the FAI are thinking this could be the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, that was floated, I guess, maybe not in explicit terms, but I think actually Niall Quinn mentioned that at a point in the road, and could you suddenly end up with a Football Ireland or a version of saying, I think you would probably face problems with UEFA and FIFA in that regard. I don't. Now, I mean, ironically enough, within the FAI, it's quite usual for League of Ireland clubs to suddenly reset and appear with a new trading company as though nothing had happened, really. But I would imagine that is the sort of a particularly nuclear option. And I think, when a certain amount, again, of funds and deals have been committed to, it will be hard to do. I mean, there'll be complexities, there'll be complications. I mean, then everything is up for grabs in terms of your stadium and on your assets and everything you own. I mean, we know that, there's, again, advanced funds are going to be drawn down from TV deals going some way into the future and other arrangements going some way into the future. So how you would sort of handle the mechanisms of looking at that, I would say it would be too complicated. But it's a sort of, we are in a situation now where to suggest nothing seems too outlandish, in terms of a discussion point. I mean, stuff that it would have seemed completely far-fetched to even discuss it. I think now things have reached this sort of point in the road where all options have to be considered. I can't see it, but at the same time, I can't really scoff at someone for suggesting it either.
Very difficult to get good value for something when the person who is the only buyer knows that you have to sell and knows that you're desperate for cash. So it's not like the IRFU are just going to gift the FAI the full market value of something like this. So I don't know how you would actually go about negotiating, and who knows if the IRFU actually need to hand over the cash when they're like, well, we're going to get this back anyway in 50 years. Why would we bother spending money on it now?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's always been one of the curious aspects of the stadium deal, of course, is that if you look at the stadium accounts on a yearly basis, the IRFU and the FAI are they're in a 50-50 ownership deal, but the stadium company still pays a rent figure every year to the IRFU because they ultimately own the land. And one of the big boasts, I guess, of the previous FAI regime would have been, the stadium had been delivered. But of course, when there's another generation coming down the road, are going to see the stadium handed back to the IRFU. Now, the view always was that, the sort of lease arrangement, well, that's based in tandem with the sort of natural shelf life of the stadium, and that when the 60-year lease approached its end, well, it's very likely that the stadium would be dated at that stage, and a new deal will be explored. But it is still a fact at the moment that ultimately, that the FAI's ownership is a lease. It's not a firm ownership of the land that's there in a prime location. So the IRFU have always had the better end of the deal. And I mean, again, you know, what would they see the value to be of doing so? I mean, well, I guess in terms of, you know, ongoing fees and so on, they'd be in a strong position. But yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, you know, people who are looking at this from the outside they aren't briefed on the IRFU position as such. They're just looking at it from a purely FAI perspective. You know, what have you got? What can you do? What can you generate revenue from? What can you generate cash from that might, you know, ease off this sort of never-ending cash flow fear that you might face over the next coming years, and things change dramatically. And that's where recommendations come from. Whether they're ever acted upon is another thing.
Yeah, I would say that the plan at the start was for the FAI to flog all these premium tickets and then be sitting on a load of cash over the next couple of decades and then build a brand spanking new stadium, all for the FAI at some point within the next 60 years. But I think that's very wishful thinking at this point.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, you know, with everything that's happened with the FAI and the FAI crisis now, I mean, you know, we go back 9 months, but really this all goes back, you know, 10 years when, you know, the FAI had the chance to get things right as regards pricing for the new stadium, and they made decisions that they didn't roll back on quickly enough, and that created pressures that they've almost been just sort of kicking that can down the road a small bit, and eventually it's caught up with them in a fairly dramatic and, I suppose, traumatic way.
Dan, great stuff. Thanks a million for joining us this morning.
Thanks, guys.
Dan McDonnell giving us his thoughts there. You can read all about that in this morning's Irish Independent.